The Mirror Room. The house sat on the edge of a forgotten road, its stone facade cracked and weathered with age. Thick ivy crept up its walls, and its windows stared out like empty eyes. To the Hartley family, it was both a blessing and a curse. Andrew Hartley had never expected to inherit anything from his reclusive Uncle Edwin, whom the family rarely spoke of. Edwin had lived alone for decades, and his death was a mystery as peculiar as the man himself. No autopsy was conducted, no funeral held, just a letter from a lawyer informing Andrew that the house now belonged to him. For Andrew, his wife Laura, and their 2 children, 16-year-old Emma and 9-year-old Daniel, the house came at the perfect time. They were drowning in debt, their cramped apartment barely holding together. Moving to Edwin's old estate seemed like a fresh start. But from the moment they arrived, something felt wrong. "It's massive," Laura said as they stepped out of the car, her tone a mixture of awe and unease. The house loomed over them, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. Emma frowned, tugging her jacket tighter. "It's creepy," she muttered, staring up at the towering structure. "Nah, it's cool," Daniel exclaimed, running toward the front door. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Andrew chuckled, ruffling his son's hair as he unlocked the door. Inside, the house was just as imposing. Dust-covered furniture filled cavernous rooms, and cobwebs draped the chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like old coins. "This will take some work," Andrew admitted, surveying the grand foyer. As they explored, they stumbled upon the room that would come to define their new home. At the end of a narrow hallway, behind an ornate oak door, was the mirror room. It was unlike anything they'd seen. Every wall was lined with tall, gilded mirrors, their frames intricate and baroque. The mirrors reflected the room infinitely, creating a dizzying effect. At the center stood a single armchair facing no particular direction. "Whoa," Daniel whispered, stepping inside. His small figure multiplied endlessly in the reflections, giving the illusion of 1,000 Daniels standing shoulder to shoulder. "This is bizarre," Laura said, her voice low. Andrew ran a hand over one of the mirror frames. The glass was cool to the touch, and the reflection seemed sharper than normal, as if the mirrors saw too much. "Uncle Edwin must have been eccentric," Andrew said, forcing a laugh. "Maybe this was his version of a man cave." Emma shivered. "I don't like it," she said, pulling Daniel away. That night, as they settled into their new home, the mirror room lingered in their minds. Daniel was the first to notice something odd. "Mom," he said as Laura tucked him into bed, "the mirrors aren't normal." "What do you mean?" Laura asked, smoothing his blanket. "They show things that aren't there," he said, his voice small. "When I looked at one earlier, I saw someone standing behind me, but no one was there." Laura hesitated, brushing it off as a child's overactive imagination. "You're probably just tired, sweetheart. Get some sleep." But Daniel wasn't the only one uneasy. That night, Emma had a nightmare. In it, she stood in the mirror room, but the mirrors didn't show her. Instead, they showed a twisted version of herself, her face pale, her eyes black, and her smile cruel. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. "It's just a dream," she whispered to herself. But as she glanced towards the dark hallway, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of movement, like a shadow slipping into the mirror room. Downstairs, Andrew couldn't sleep either. He wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water, his thoughts swirling. Passing the hallway to the mirror room, he paused. The door was ajar. "Strange," he muttered, stepping closer. He could see the faint glint of reflections in the dim light. The room seemingly untouched. But as he reached for the doorknob, the hair on his arms stood on end. In one of the mirrors, he thought he saw himself, but older, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He blinked, and the image was gone. Andrew laughed nervously, closing the door. "Just my imagination," he said, but his voice trembled. Unbeknownst to the Hartleys, the mirror room had begun its work. The reflections were more than illusions. They were warnings. The Hartleys settled into their new home over the following weeks, though the adjustment was far from smooth. The house resisted them, its creaks and groans echoing at odd hours as if alive. Laura focused on cleaning and organizing, determined to make the old estate livable, while Andrew worked on small repairs. Yet the mirror room remained untouched, its door firmly closed. No one talked about it, but each family member felt its pull in different ways. Emma found herself standing outside the mirror room one afternoon, unable to remember why she had come. She hadn't meant to go near it. She avoided the room since her nightmare. But there she was, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Don't go in there." She jumped and turned to find Daniel behind her, clutching a toy car. His face was unusually pale. "I wasn't going to," Emma said, though her voice sounded unsure even to herself. Daniel hesitated. "I hear them talking." "Who?" "The people in the mirrors." Emma stared at him. Daniel wasn't the type to make things up, but she couldn't believe what he was saying. "Stop messing around," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "I'm not," Daniel insisted. "They talk at night. I hear them calling my name." That evening, Laura brought it up at dinner. "Daniel said something strange about the mirror room today," she began cautiously. Andrew paused mid-bite, his fork hovering. "What did he say?" Laura hesitated. "He thinks the mirrors are talking to him." Andrew chuckled nervously. "Kids have wild imaginations, especially in a house like this. It's probably just him adjusting." Emma looked up from her plate, her face serious. "It's not just him. That room is weird. I've had nightmares about it, and sometimes I feel like it's watching me." Andrew set his fork down, his expression shifting to concern. "You too?" Laura raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, asterisk you two asterisk?" Andrew sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've seen things, in the mirrors. I thought I was just overtired, but what?" Laura pressed. Andrew hesitated before answering. "Sometimes I see myself in the reflections, but it's not me. It's someone older, weaker, like a version of me that's falling apart." Silence fell over the table. Even Daniel, who usually fidgeted during meals, sat still, his eyes wide. "We should cover the mirrors," Laura finally said. "Or get rid of them entirely." "That's easier said than done," Andrew replied. "Those mirrors are bolted to the walls. Removing them could damage the whole room." "Then we lock the door and leave it alone," Laura said firmly. Andrew nodded, but Emma wasn't convinced. "I don't think locking it will stop whatever's happening," she muttered. "Yeah." That night, the house grew colder than usual. Laura woke up shivering and reached for an extra blanket, only to notice the faint sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. "Andrew?" she whispered, nudging her husband. He groaned and rolled over. "What is it? Do you hear that?" The two listened in tense silence as the sound grew louder. It wasn't footsteps, it was more like the gentle scraping of something being dragged. "Stay here," Andrew said, climbing out of bed. Grabbing a flashlight, he made his way down the creaking stairs. The sound grew clearer, pulling him toward the mirror room. The door was ajar. Andrew frowned, his grip tightening on the flashlight. He was certain he'd locked it earlier. Pushing the door open, he shone the light into the room. The mirrors stared back at him, reflecting his single beam of light 100 times over. For a moment, the room seemed normal, But then, in one of the mirrors, he saw movement. A figure stood behind him. Andrew spun around, but no one was there. He turned back to the mirror and froze. The reflection of the figure remained, its face a dark blur, its shape distorted. Andrew stumbled backward, his heart racing. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers began. Low and indistinct at first, they grew louder, their words overlapping and incomprehensible. Andrew banged on the door, shouting for help. The whispers only intensified, drowning out his cries. And then they stopped. The door creaked open, and Andrew tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. Laura was there, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she demanded, helping him to his feet. Andrew shook his head, his hands trembling. "It's not just a room," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something in there, something watching us." From the darkness of the mirror room, the faint outline of a shadow lingered in one of the mirrors, its presence unacknowledged but undeniably real. The decision to lock the mirror room was made the next morning. Andrew used an old padlock he found in the garage and secured the door tightly. "We'll call someone to take those mirrors out," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the house seemed to have other plans. Emma was the first to notice the changes. That afternoon, as she stood in the hallway near the mirror room, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A faint ripple moved across one of the reflective surfaces, like a stone dropped into still water. She froze, staring at the closed door. "Emma?" Laura's voice broke her trance. Emma jumped, spinning to face her mother. I thought I saw something," she stammered. Laura placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll deal with it. Just stay away from that room, okay?" Emma nodded but didn't move. The air around the mirror room felt heavier now, pressing down on her chest. That night, the whispers returned. They slithered through the walls like a cold draft, growing louder as the hours passed. Daniel woke up first, sitting upright in bed. He clutched his blanket, his small frame trembling. "They're calling me," he whispered. Across the hall, Emma tossed and turned, her dreams filled with distorted images. She was standing in the mirror room, staring into a reflection that wasn't hers. The Emma in the glass was smirking, her eyes filled with malice. "Come closer," the reflection whispered, pressing her hands against the other side of the glass. "I can show you what you really are." Emma jolted awake, her heart pounding. The house was silent except for the faint creak of floorboards. She glanced toward her bedroom door and froze. It was open. Downstairs, Andrew and Laura sat in the living room, unable to sleep. Laura sipped tea, her hands shaking slightly. "We need to leave," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Andrew frowned. "We can't just run. We don't have the money for that, and besides, this is our house now." "This house isn't ours," Laura snapped. "It belongs to whatever's in that room." As if on cue, the lights flickered. Both of them turned toward the staircase where the faint footsteps echoed. "Daniel," Andrew called out, his voice uncertain. There was no reply. Emma wandered the hallway outside her room, her body moving as if in a trance. She wasn't sure why she was walking, but something compelled her, drawing her toward the mirror room. The padlock was gone. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling out. Emma stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. "Emma?" Daniel's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing at the end of the hallway, his wide eyes reflecting the faint glow from the room. "I have to see," she whispered. "No, you don't," Daniel insisted, stepping toward her. "They want you to go in there. They want all of us." Before Emma could reply, the door swung open. The light from the room grew brighter, spilling out like liquid gold. But the reflections in the mirrors were wrong. They didn't show the hallway or the siblings standing in it. Instead, they revealed a twisted, shadowy version of the Hartleys' lives. In one mirror, Andrew and Laura were screaming at each other, their faces contorted with anger. In another, Emma stood over Daniel, her expression cold as she held a knife. The scenes shifted rapidly, each darker than the last. Laura, sobbing in an empty room, Andrew wandering aimlessly in the dark, Daniel trapped in a burning house. Emma felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if the air had been knocked out of her. "This isn't real," she whispered, though the images felt all too vivid. Or maybe it is. The voice came from inside the room. It was soft, almost melodic, but laced with a cruel edge. "Come in," it beckoned. "See what your lives could become." Daniel grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her back. "Don't listen to it," he shouted. But Emma couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirrors. One of them showed her standing in the room, alone, her reflection staring back with a wicked grin. "Emma!" Andrew's voice cut through the haze. He and Laura ran up the stairs, their faces pale with fear. The light from the mirror room dimmed suddenly, the whispers fading. The door slammed shut, and the hallway was plunged into darkness. Later, as the family huddled together in the living room, Andrew made a decision. "We can't stay here," he said. "We'll leave tomorrow, whatever's in that room. It's dangerous." "But will it let us leave?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. The house was silent, but the weight of the mirror room lingered, heavy and suffocating. And deep within the glass, something stirred. Morning came heavy and gray, the sky outside cloaked in an oppressive blanket of clouds. The Hartleys hurried to pack, their movements hurried and silent. The house seemed to resist their efforts. Drawers jammed, bags tore, and even the air grew thick with an unshakable sense of foreboding. Laura zipped the last suitcase with trembling hands. "We'll stay at a motel until we figure this out," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Andrew nodded, his face pale. "We'll call someone to cleanse the house or demolish it if we have to." But the unspoken question hung between them. Asterisk, would the house let them go? As the family gathered in the foyer, a low groan reverberated through the house. It was a deep, guttural sound, as if the structure itself was waking up. "We have to move now," Andrew said sharply, ushering Emma and Daniel toward the door. The doorknob wouldn't turn. Andrew yanked at it with all his strength, but it refused to budge. "What the hell?" Behind them, the sound of glass shattering echoed from upstairs. Emma froze, clutching Daniel's hand tightly. "The mirrors," she whispered. Laura stepped back, her voice trembling. "We have to get out, break a window if we have to." Andrew grabbed a chair from the dining room and swung it at the nearest window, but the glass didn't break. Instead, it rippled, the surface shifting like water. "They're everywhere," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "The mirrors are everywhere now." The groaning intensified, and the house seemed to close in around them. The walls shimmered, taking on a reflective sheen. Every surface, the windows, the furniture, even the floor, began to show distorted reflections. Andrew stumbled back, his eyes darting around. "This can't be real." "Mom, look!" Daniel cried, pointing at the wall. In the reflections, their family wasn't packing or trying to escape. Instead, they saw twisted versions of themselves. Andrew sat slumped on the floor, aged and defeated. Laura stood crying, her face streaked with dirt and blood. Emma was nowhere to be seen, and Daniel stood alone, his reflection staring back with hollow, lifeless eyes. "No," Laura whispered, clutching her chest. "This isn't us. "This isn't us." But the images in the mirrors didn't waver. They grew clearer, more vivid, until it felt as if the alternate versions were more real than the family standing in the foyer. Suddenly, the light in the room dimmed, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "They're showing us what we'll become," Emma said, her voice trembling. "No," Andrew snapped, "they're lying. None of this is real." "Then why does it feel so true?" Emma shot back, tears streaming down her face. Before anyone could respond, the floor beneath them shifted. The wooden boards dissolved into an infinite expanse of reflective glass. The family stumbled, clutching each other as the world around them disappeared into a shimmering void. The mirror room had consumed the house. Emma found herself standing alone, her family nowhere in sight. The vast expanse of mirrors stretched endlessly around her. Each reflection was a scene, some familiar, some horrifying. She saw herself as a child, smiling in a sunny backyard. She saw herself older, bitter, and alone. "Which one is real?" a voice echoed around her. She turned to see her reflection step out of the nearest mirror. It wasn't quite her. The face was sharper, the eyes darker. "This house doesn't trap you," the reflection said. "It shows you what you truly are." Emma backed away. "You're lying." "Am I?" the reflection asked, tilting its head. "Maybe this is your chance to change, or maybe it's too late." Meanwhile, Laura and Andrew found themselves in separate reflections, each trapped in their own private nightmares. Laura stood in a house identical to theirs, but it was empty. She wandered from room to room, calling out for her family, but no one answered. The mirrors mocked her, showing glimpses of Andrew and the kids, but always just out of reach. Andrew, on the other hand, was surrounded by mirrors that showed him over and over, aging, breaking, collapsing under the weight of his own failures. "You could have stopped this," one of the reflections whispered. "Shut up," Andrew shouted, punching the glass. It didn't break. Daniel, the youngest, stood in the darkest corner of the mirror world. The shadows whispered his name, beckoning him toward a mirror that reflected nothing at all. "Come closer," the void seemed to say. He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I want my mom and dad." But the void didn't care. It loomed closer, swallowing everything around him. The family's voices echoed through the mirror world, calling for each other, their cries growing fainter with each passing moment. The mirrors responded with silence, their surfaces rippling and shifting until the Hartleys were reflected no more. The house stood quiet and empty once more. In the mirror room, the glass shimmered faintly, its surface smooth and